and in so many people's. I mean, even when I was in makeup just now, somebody came up almost crying, saying how much that she meant to them. And every day people tell me what an inspiration she was, how much they miss her, what they did the day.
The historical narrative of the British royal family has just been shattered. Earl Charles Spencer, Princess Diana's brother, has just released a wave of explosive new revelations regarding his late sister. This is not a collection of familiar anecdotes or repeated stories from the past. Operating from the ancestral gates of Althorp House, the Earl has unveiled a strictly guarded personal archive, including unreleased diaries and recorded tapes in Diana's own hand. These newly exposed documents directly challenge the palace's official historical narrative, shedding new light on the deep psychological warfare and hidden power struggles she faced within the monarchy. The battle for the truth has officially reignited. The sudden broadside from Althorp House. A heavy, low-hanging mist blanketed the expansive lawns of Althorp House on a sharp morning in 2026. The historic iron gates of the Northamptonshire estate, which had remained closed to the public for months, were suddenly thrown open to admit a line of black executive sedans. Inside these vehicles were top-tier editors, legal correspondents, and lead investigative reporters representing the most prominent news syndicates from London, New York, and Paris. They had not received a standard polished press release from a public relations agency. Instead, their news desks had been activated by a brief, encrypted notification sent directly from the personal office of Earl Charles Spencer. The message contained a single, chilling sentence stating that the historical record of the 20th century's most famous princess was about to be permanently rewritten. The journalists were quietly escorted into the grand library of the estate, a room surrounded by generations of aristocratic history and thousands of leather-bound volumes. There were no cameras allowed for this initial phase, no bright television lights, and no microphones taped to the furniture. The raw, unfiltered nature of the setting set a tone of immense institutional gravity. Earl Spencer stood behind a large oak table, his expression completely serious, as two security officers placed a reinforced steel dispatch box on the surface between them. This box had been retrieved from a deeply buried family vault located beneath the foundation of the estate, where it had remained completely untouched and fiercely guarded since 1997. The moment the Earl turned the key to unlock the container, the carefully manufactured narrative that the British monarchy had spent nearly 30 years constructing was completely upended. Inside the box lay a massive, meticulously preserved cache of personal journals, handwritten memos, and official legal documents written entirely in Princess Diana's unmistakable fluid calligraphy. These were not casual reflections on her daily routine or standard notes about her charitable patronage. This was a precise chronological record of the intense psychological pressure, systematic isolation, and high-stakes power struggles she faced behind the palace walls during the final 2 years of her life. The explosive new revelations were about to hit the international media like a physical blow. Earl Spencer began the briefing by reading a direct excerpt from a journal entry dated precisely 3 weeks before the tragic events in Paris. In the text, Diana had detailed a specific private confrontation that had taken place inside a secure holding room at Buckingham Palace involving senior court officials and representatives of the state intelligence services. She had documented the exact phrases used by the courtiers, who had issued a stark institutional warning regarding her ongoing efforts to independently influence international diplomatic policy through her global landmine campaigns. The raw clarity of her words explicitly exposed a dark, systemic effort to undermine her public credibility, completely shattering the myth that her final months were spent in a state of chaotic, unvetted erraticism. The immediate reaction across the capital was a state of total, unadulterated panic within the Royal Communications headquarters. The public relations teams at Clarence House and Kensington Palace had received zero advance warning that the Spencer family was preparing to launch this massive historical broadside. For decades, the establishment had operated under the comfortable assumption that the passing of time and the systematic rehabilitation of the current court had safely buried the inconvenient truths of the 90s. They had spent millions of pounds from the royal purse to airbrush the human cost of the monarchy's survival out of the official history books. Now, an independent aristocratic house was presenting a mountain of physical, contemporaneous evidence that threatened to dismantle their modern credibility overnight. The legal validity of the archive was completely undeniable, leaving the palace lawyers with no immediate room to launch a counteroffensive. Earl Spencer's legal team had spent the preceding 6 months quietly submitting the original paper stocks, ink patterns, and signatures to independent forensic document examiners in Switzerland. The technical reports, which were distributed to the journalists in thick leather folders, confirmed with absolute scientific certainty that every single page in the cache was entirely authentic and completely unmodified. The Sussex and Wales legal advisors could not simply issue a generic statement dismissing the diaries as unverified family gossip or malicious fabrication. The physical reality of the ink on the page was a permanent, unassailable fact that the court would now have to face in the open. The Earl explained that the family had chosen to maintain absolute silence for nearly 3 decades out of a deep desire to protect Prince William and Prince Harry while they were navigating their youth and building their own independent lives within the system. However, watching the recent aggressive public relations campaigns to systematically elevate the status of the people who had caused his sister profound psychological anguish had broken his patience. He stated that the Spencer family had a sacred, non-negotiable duty to ensure that the true historical legacy of the People's Princess was not slowly airbrushed out of existence to legitimize the current court hierarchy. The broadside from Althorp House was a definitive declaration of war against the palace's campaign of historical revisionism. As the briefing concluded, the journalists rushed toward the estate's communication room to file their breaking news flashes, their fingers flying across laptop keyboards as the true scale of the exposure began to register globally. The news syndicates immediately altered their programming schedules, preparing for a series of massive front-page features and special broadcast reports tracking the line-by-line contents of the newly discovered archive. The fortress of public relations that the monarchy had worked so tirelessly to build around its history was buckling under the weight of an unyielding physical paper trail. The past had officially broken through the palace defenses, and the Markle family crisis, the crown jewels lockdown, and the internal family rifts were suddenly joined by the most dangerous challenge of all: the unvarnished voice of Princess Diana herself, speaking directly from the grave, the hidden tapes that the palace tried to suppress. The low, familiar hiss of analog magnetic tape vibrated through a pair of high-fidelity studio monitors inside a secure audio laboratory in Geneva. The room was entirely soundproofed, stripped of decorative furnishings, and filled with state-of-the-art acoustic analysis equipment. A forensic audio technician sat before a mixing console, his eyes locked on a digital waveform display that bounced with every syllable spoken by a soft, unmistakable voice. Sitting immediately behind him was Earl Spencer, his arms crossed tightly as he listened to his sister detail the final, agonizing months of her life. These audio files were not a collection of leaked telephone gossip or recycled broadcast snippets. They were the unreleased, master-grade recordings that Princess Diana had captured in absolute secrecy during the spring of 1997. The presence of these physical recordings inside a foreign laboratory represented the ultimate institutional failure for the British royal establishment. For decades, senior courtiers in London had operated under the belief that every tape, transcript, and personal diary from that tumultuous era had been safely accounted for, heavily redacted, or permanently locked away inside the royal archives at Windsor Castle. The palace had spent decades utilizing aggressive non-disclosure agreements, specialized privacy lawyers, and diplomatic pressure to ensure that no further unfiltered testimony from the late Princess of Wales could ever emerge to disrupt the modern court. But they had completely overlooked a private safe deposit box held at a financial institution in Switzerland, a secure vault that only the Spencer family had the statutory right to access. The acoustic technicians had spent 3 months conducting an exhaustive validation process before Earl Spencer authorized the global news syndicates to receive the first audio files. Every single track was subjected to a rigorous line-by-line frequency analysis to eliminate any possibility of digital manipulation, artificial intelligence voice cloning, or historical forgery. The technical data sheets bearing the official certification stamps of the Swiss Federal Testing Institute confirmed with absolute scientific precision that the tapes were entirely authentic. The voice print, the underlying magnetic signature of the tape stock, and the specific room tone matched the exact equipment Diana had utilized during her private communications in the late 20th century. The contents of the first audio log hit the international media with immediate, shattering force. On the tape, dated exactly 6 weeks before the tragic event in Paris, Diana spoke with absolute clarity about her profound, growing fears regarding her personal security detail. She detailed a specific incident where her official state-provided protection officers were abruptly reassigned and replaced by an unfamiliar security team answerable directly to the Central Palace administration. She explained in her own words that she felt systematically monitored, explaining that her private telephone lines had been tapped, and her travel itineraries intentionally leaked to aggressive paparazzi agencies to generate a state of constant, exhausting public pressure. The raw clarity of her voice explicitly exposed a dark, coordinated effort by traditional court factions to undermine her independence. This unvarnished testimony directly contradicted the official findings of past state investigations, which had consistently framed her security anxieties as mere paranoia or emotional instability. Listeners around the world were suddenly forced to confront the voice of the world's most photographed woman, explaining in meticulous and calm detail the exact machinery used to isolate her from her friends and allies. The narrative that the modern monarchy had worked so tirelessly to project to the global public was being dismantled minute by minute by the very person they had tried to silence. The immediate reaction inside Buckingham Palace was described by high-level palace sources as a state of absolute, unadulterated panic. The communications director for King Charles convened a midnight emergency meeting with senior lawyers from the Treasury Solicitor's Department to review their legal options. They desperately searched for an international judicial injunction that could block global streaming platforms and news networks from broadcasting the audio files. However, the legal advisors quickly realized they were entirely powerless to stop the transmission. The physical tapes were held under Swiss jurisdiction, and the copyright privileges belonged exclusively to the Spencer estate, rendering the British court's traditional legal threats completely useless. The psychological impact of the audio logs began to heavily destabilize the current court hierarchy at Clarence House. The specific dates mentioned on the recordings coincided precisely with the period when the palace was launching its initial, multi-million-pound public relations campaign to rehabilitate the public image of Queen Camilla. On the tapes, Diana explicitly detailed the intense psychological toll of discovering that her private household staff were regularly being briefed by outside publicists to plant negative stories about her mental state in the Sunday tabloids. Hearing the late princess outline the exact strategy used to airbrush her out of the family, history completely shattered the modern, drama-free aesthetic the current queen had worked for decades to establish. The international business community reacted to the audio leaks with extreme caution, with major media networks adjusting their programming schedules to accommodate the breaking news features. Television executives in New York City and Los Angeles immediately paused pre-production on several authorized royal documentaries, realizing that any content that relied on the palace's official historical timeline was now completely obsolete. Corporate sponsors began pulling their advertisements from lifestyle platforms associated with the royal family, terrified that being linked to a massive historical cover-up would alienate modern consumers. The economic valuation of the royal brand was fracturing under the weight of an unyielding voice speaking directly from the past. As the second audio track began to play inside the Geneva laboratory, Earl Spencer instructed his legal assistants to prepare the next phase of the global digital rollout. They were fully prepared to release the complete, unredacted audio archive to an independent international university archive, ensuring that the historical data would remain permanently accessible to researchers, biographers, and the global public, free from any form of state censorship. The defensive wall that the monarchy had spent nearly 30 years constructing around its history had been permanently breached. The unvarnished voice of Princess Diana had returned to the center of the global conversation, and the House of Windsor was officially running out of time to answer for its past. Prince William and Prince Harry forced into a sudden alliance. A highly secure encrypted satellite phone line buzzed on a private desk in Montecito while the morning sun was still low over the Pacific. Almost simultaneously, a matching device activated inside the private quarters of Kensington Palace in London. For years, the global public had watched a cold, seemingly unmendable estrangement play out between the two brothers. Their relationship had been reduced to formal legal notifications, bitter public relations counter-strikes, and a total breakdown in personal communication. But the sheer institutional gravity of the Althorp House disclosures bypassed every single layer of modern hostility. The sudden, unvarnished reemergence of their mother's voice created an immediate, overriding instinct that forced Prince William and Prince Harry into a sudden, historic alliance. The cross-continental conversation began without any of the standard administrative intermediaries or private secretaries who typically manage their rare interactions. The brothers were speaking directly to each other as sons, bound by a shared childhood trauma that no royal title or geographical exile could ever erase. Harry had spent the morning reviewing the leaked audio files from Geneva alongside his personal legal advisors in California, while William had been briefed by the state archivists at Windsor Castle. The emotional impact of hearing Princess Diana detail her profound fears regarding her personal security detail hit both men with the force of a physical blow. The decades of silence, public feuding, and media manipulation evaporated as they realized their mother's true historical legacy was actively being caught in an international legal crossfire. The primary objective of this sudden alliance was the immediate creation of a unified legal front to protect the newly exposed archive from external interference. High-level intelligence briefings delivered to William's office indicated that senior bureaucrats within the British Privy Council were quietly drafting an emergency state intervention pattern. Government lawyers were exploring ways to use national security statutes to seize the physical journals and master tapes from Earl Spencer, claiming that the material contained sensitive information regarding state intelligence protocols from 1997. William made it absolutely clear to his brother that he would not allow the state apparatus to suppress or redact their mother's own words for the sake of institutional convenience. The brothers quickly coordinated their respective legal teams across two entirely different jurisdictions to build an impenetrable defensive wall around the Spencer family archive. Harry's high-powered trial attorneys in Los Angeles worked in tandem with William's constitutional advisors in the United Kingdom to draft a joint, binding declaration of intent. The document stated with absolute legal clarity that the Duke of Sussex and the Prince of Wales held a joint, unassailable copyright interest in their mother's personal image, voice print, and private historical documents. By merging their legal rights, they effectively blocked any attempts by the British government or traditional court factions to launch a state-sanctioned seizure of the files. The state could not claim ownership over an archive that was universally protected by the explicit unified consent of the direct heirs to the estate. The sudden unification of the brothers sent a massive wave of absolute panic through the central administration offices at Buckingham Palace. For years, senior courtiers had relied heavily on the division between William and Harry to manage the monarchy's public relations strategies, using the contrast between the dutiful heir and the exiled prince to balance the news cycles. That convenient framework completely collapsed in a single afternoon. The palace inner circle was suddenly facing a nightmare scenario. A totally unified generation of younger royals who were fully prepared to use their combined global leverage to challenge the official historical narrative of the court. The realization that the brothers had put aside their immense personal differences to defend their mother's memory signaled a profound shift in the internal balance of power. The emotional toll of this alliance was particularly visible within the private offices of Kensington Palace. Staff members reported that the atmosphere inside the prince's study was intensely serious, with William refusing to take any incoming calls from his father's private secretary or the communications director at Clarence House. He was completely focused on working with Harry to establish a secure, independent digital repository for the audio files, ensuring that the historical data would remain permanently safe from any future cyber attacks or unauthorized legal redactions. The joint project was an extraordinary display of strategic coordination, proving that Despite the deep personal fractures that had divided their homes, their foundational loyalty to Princess Diana remained completely untouched by time. The alliance also immediately altered the dynamic of Harry's ongoing legal disputes with the British media establishment. For months, his civil claims regarding privacy breaches had been viewed by the public as an independent, isolated crusade against the tabloid press. But with William now actively supporting the legal defense of the maternal family archive, the campaign transformed into a coordinated, state-level movement for absolute historical transparency. The brothers were letting the entire media apparatus know that the era of treating their mother's private suffering as a source of commercial entertainment or public relations leverage was permanently over. They were drawing a hard, unyielding line in the sand, backed by the full weight of their combined royal statuses. As the late-night conference calls between London and California finally drew to a close, the true significance of the brothers' sudden truce began to crystallize for constitutional scholars across the country. William and Harry had successfully demonstrated that when the ultimate integrity of their mother's memory was threatened, they would always choose each other over the institutional machinery of the state. The legal defenses were fully synchronized, the joint declaration was logged into the court records, and the House of Windsor was left to face a completely transformed internal reality. The modern monarchy was no longer just fighting an external public relations crisis. It was now facing an unyielding alliance of its own children, fiercely determined to ensure that the true voice of Princess Diana would finally be heard by the entire world. Queen Camilla's name re-emerges in the historical crosshairs. The long, multi-million-pound public relations campaign designed to secure Queen Camilla's historical rehabilitation was completely halted by a single sentence written in black ink. Inside the main study at Clarence House, senior media advisors stood in a tight circle around a secure monitor, watching a live transcript from the Althorp House briefing clear the security filters. For more than 2 decades, the palace inner circle had worked with clinical precision to reframe the narrative of the 1990s. They had transitioned her image from the most criticized woman in London to the crowned queen of the realm, presenting her as a reliable, dignified anchor for King Charles. But as Princess Diana's original journals from 1997 were translated into digital formats, the meticulously manufactured public relations armor completely disintegrated. The text hidden inside the newly unlocked family vault did not contain vague personal feelings or emotional speculation. It was a cold, clinical, and chronological log of specific documented interactions that took place within the secure perimeters of the royal estates. Diana had kept a detailed record of the exact public relations strategies being deployed by Charles's private team during the final months of her marriage. She documented the precise dates when high-level publicists were brought into the palace infrastructure to deliberately plant negative stories about her mental stability in the Sunday broadsheets. The explicit purpose of those leaks, according to her own handwritten notes, was to systematically lower her global approval ratings, to prepare the public for Camilla's eventual integration into the formal court hierarchy. This raw historical record placed the current queen's name directly back into the international media crosshairs with devastating force. The global audience, which had slowly grown accustomed to seeing Camilla lead major state functions and represent the British crown on international tours, was suddenly forced to confront a primary source document that shattered the myth of a peaceful, organic transition. The journals detailed a highly coordinated, aggressive campaign of psychological displacement. Diana explicitly noted that she felt her domestic security boundaries were being actively manipulated to create an environment of constant vulnerability, an environment that would force her to withdraw from public life and surrender her institutional status entirely. The contrast between these unvarnished historical logs and the modern image of the monarchy was too stark for international news syndicates to ignore. Major broadcast networks in New York City and across Europe immediately altered their editorial plans for the upcoming winter season of 2026. Executive producers pulled pre-scheduled features celebrating the current queen's charitable patronages, replacing them with live panel discussions anchored by forensic historians who analyzed the newly released Althorp files line by line. The commercial viability of the royal brand began to buckle under the weight of this sudden historical transparency. Corporate partners who had spent millions of pounds aligning their luxury products with the modern court's image of refined stability quickly paused their advertising campaigns, terrified of the public backlash surrounding a major institutional cover-up. Inside the private quarters of the king's residence, the emotional and administrative toll of the exposure created an atmosphere of absolute crisis. Senior courtiers warned King Charles that the escalating scandal was actively destroying the monarchy's remaining approval ratings among the younger demographics across the United Kingdom. The public was no longer looking at Camilla as a reassuring figure of modern duty. They were looking at her through the lens of a historical archive that documented the immense human cost of her elevation to the throne. The king's team found themselves completely unable to launch a standard public relations counteroffensive, because any attempt to publicly challenge the integrity of Diana's journals would be viewed by the global public as an act of cruelty against a deceased mother, an act that would permanently alienate Prince William and Prince Harry. The true strategic devastation of the journal leak lay in how it completely paralyzed Camilla's ability to execute her official court duties. During an emergency administrative meeting that afternoon, her private secretary noted that several high-profile literacy charities and domestic violence support networks had quietly reached out to request a temporary postponement of her scheduled winter appearances. The organizations were terrified that her presence at their annual gala events would draw an army of investigative legal reporters, transforming their charitable initiatives into a circus of uncomfortable questions about the 1990s paper trail. The queen consort was effectively being isolated within her own palace, forced to watch her hard-won public standing fade away as her sister-in-law's bloodline systematically exposed the hard reality of the past. The pressure inside the royal household intensified as the Althorp legal team began prepared to distribute the audio logs that corresponded with the specific journal entries from late July 1997. These recordings featured Diana's actual voice, confirming the exact names of the media executives who had agreed to participate in the palace-led rehabilitation strategy. Facing the reality of an absolute institutional collapse, Camilla reportedly confronted the king in his private study, demanding that the state use its full judicial authority to seal the files under international intellectual property protocols. But the legal reality remained completely unyielding. The unified defensive alliance between William and Harry had locked the archive behind an impenetrable wall of combined heir consensus, leaving the king and queen with zero legal avenues to suppress the truth. As the late afternoon sun began to set behind the ancient trees of the estate, the true structural impact of the Spencer broadside became completely undeniable for constitutional scholars. The narrative of the modern, drama-free House of Windsor had been permanently broke by the raw clarity of a historical record that refused to stay buried. Camilla sat at her desk, looking at the international headlines that were flashing across the news screens, realizing that no amount of public relations management, elite styling, or state privilege could ever truly erase the written evidence of the past. The ghost of Princess Diana had returned to dictate the terms of the court's legitimacy, and the current queen was left trapped in a historical crossfire with absolutely nowhere left to hide. The final statutory warning to Buckingham Palace. The morning light cut through the high Gothic windows of the Privy Council Annex in London, illuminating a leather-bound legal brief that had just been hand-delivered by a courier from Althorp House. The document bore the signature of Earl Spencer's lead constitutional counsel. It was not a polite request for an administrative meeting or a suggestion for a quiet, private family compromise. It was a formal statutory warning, copy-stamped and registered with the High Court of Justice before it was walked through the palace gates. The legal framework utilized by the Spencer estate effectively placed a permanent, unyielding boundary around the newly exposed historical archive, forcing the sovereign's private advisors to face a legal reality they could not manipulate or dissolve through public relations spin. The statutory warning outlined a highly precise, multi-tiered protocol regarding the permanent preservation and global distribution of Princess Diana's original journals and audio logs. The Spencer legal team made it absolutely clear that if any state official, government ministry, or royal private secretary attempted to deploy national security statutes to suppress the collection, the entire unredacted digital archive would immediately be transferred to an international university repository based in Switzerland. This move was an extraordinary masterclass in legal positioning. By establishing a binding automatic leak mechanism that operated completely outside the geographical jurisdiction of the United Kingdom, the Earl had completely stripped Buckingham Palace of its traditional domestic enforcement powers. The state could not issue a seizure order against an archive that was legally programmed to duplicate itself across the globe the moment a restriction was attempted. The text of the warning also included an extraordinary clause that directly altered the internal power dynamics of the modern court hierarchy. The Spencer attorneys noted that they had officially granted a specialized, independent supervisory interest in the archive to the private office of Catherine, the Princess of Wales, at Kensington Palace. This strategic maneuver placed immense, unprecedented leverage directly into the hands of the future Queen Consort. Catherine was now the only individual within the senior tiers of the active royal family who possessed the statutory right to review the historical files before they were cleared for public release. By positioning her as the ultimate internal gatekeeper, Earl Spencer had effectively ensured that the future of the crown's legitimacy was completely decoupled from the immediate defensive strategies of Clarence House and King Charles. The quiet realization among constitutional scholars in 2026 was that the shadow of Princess Diana still held the ultimate power over the realm's survival. Senior courtiers who reviewed the warning realized that any attempt to launch an aggressive public relations counteroffensive would completely alienate the younger generation of the family. The Prince of Wales had already demonstrated his total willingness to stand alongside Prince Harry to defend their mother's memory, creating an impenetrable barrier of heir consensus that left the current monarch completely isolated within his own court. The palace was forced to accept a humiliating state of absolute passivity, knowing that a single misstep or a weak public denial would trigger the immediate release of the remaining audio logs, a development that would permanently destroy the monarchy's standing with the global public. The economic and structural fallout from this final statutory warning rippled across the international media networks that manage the royal family's commercial brand. Television producers and digital content syndicates realized that the official historical timeline provided by the court was now completely obsolete, forcing them to scrap millions of pounds worth of pre-recorded biographical content. The public demand for absolute historical transparency was at an all-time high, with millions of viewers tuning in to daily broadcasts to track the line-by-line disclosures from the Althorp vault. The defensive walls that the establishment had spent nearly 30 years constructing around its past had been permanently demolished, leaving the modern House of Windsor to navigate an incredibly volatile, unpredictable future where the unvarnished voice of the past was finally driving the destiny of the crown. As the final legal notifications were logged into the state archives, the true significance of the Spencer broadside became completely undeniable for every faction within the establishment. The modern monarchy could no longer protect its image by simply buying into high-priced publicity campaigns or relying on traditional protocols of absolute silence. The physical reality of the ink on the page and the clarity of the audio files had forced the court to face the unvarnished human cost of its own historical survival. The gears of the state had turned. The final statutory warning had been delivered with absolute force, and the family was left with no choice but to listen to the voice of the woman they had tried so hard to leave behind. The past has broken through the palace defenses with absolute devastating force, leaving the modern British monarchy to face the raw, unfiltered reality of its own hidden history. Earl Spencer's explosive new revelations and the unyielding legal alliance of Princess Diana's children have completely rewritten the rules of the game, forcing a divided royal family to confront the voice of the woman they tried to airbrush out of existence. The fortress of public relations has completely collapsed under the weight of an undeniable historical paper trail, leaving the current court with absolutely nowhere left to hide. What do you think Prince William and Prince Harry will do next, now that their mother's deepest secrets and private struggles have been fully laid bare to the world? Do you think the modern monarchy can ever truly recover its public credibility after this massive historical exposure? Drop your honest thoughts and theories in the comments section below. Make sure to hit that subscribe button right now. Turn on your notifications so you never miss a single update, and smash the like button to support our independent royal breakdowns. We thank you for watching, and we will see you in the next video as the battle for the truth continues to unfold.